Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's exclusive stream with Dan Kovalik. He's a human rights lawyer, a journalist, and the author of The Case for Palestine, Why It Matters and Why You Should Care. Dan was recently in Syria. He just returned from Syria, so I wanted to have this conversation with him to ask what he saw firsthand in the country which has recently witnessed a regime change war. Dan, I'm very happy to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be with you.
Dan, did you know that on Amazon Deutschland or Amazon Germany, your book, The Case for Palestine, is reviewed 5 out of 5? So you received the full points here in Germany by whoever bought your book.
That's great. And good to hear. I did not know that. Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, so guys, the book, The Case for Palestine, is in the description below. You can purchase it from Germany or from Europe or from the United States. So all the relevant links are in the description below. Dan, let's go one step back. I think we lost Dan's connection. I just wanted to ask him, let's take one step back ask him
about... I'm here.
Electricity is gone.
Yeah, I'm here. The lights just went off. They'll come back. I'm in
No worries.
Beirut, so we always lose electricity. It'll be back on, and you'll see me. But I'm here.
No worries. So let's take one step back.
That's how it
goes. That's something I'm very used to. And now, after living quite like 10 years in Europe, I forgot about these electricity shortages. But this is how the people are used to on daily basis in the region. It's back. Then, if we take one step back, the regime change happened, and Assad fled the country. And did you decide to go to Syria then, or this was spontaneous? How did you end up in Syria?
Yes, well, I did want to go because I had been there twice in 2021, and I did want to see for myself what was happening in Syria now post overthrow of Assad, and I actually went as a actually asked me to do it, and that was a great opportunity. So I went with them into Syria from Beirut, which is the typical way to go. You fly to Beirut and drive about an hour to the border. It takes about, if you're lucky, half an hour or so to get through the borders, and then about another hour to Damascus. Now, we had to make a decision because at the time we decided I would go, one, there was no real customs immigration operating on the Syrian side. So you could just walk in, right? And it was very easy to get press credentials. But by the time I was preparing to leave, things were beginning to change. There is now people at the border, and a new process has been put in place, a more formalized process to apply for press credentials, which I did. And by the time I waited around about a week in Beirut, I still didn't have an answer on whether I had credentials, and we decided we'd go anyway. I'd enter as a tourist and see if I would get my credentials while I was there. That never happened. I got about 2.5 days into my trip, I finally got a response from the foreign media office saying that they had decided not to give me credentials. So we kept working anyway. We were working up to that point. We kept working anyway, but we didn't stay as long as we had planned because we did think there was some risk to continuing.
Let's see if this is a technical problem or the electricity is gone on Dan's side. You know, this is not even funny. While he's away, I just want to make this comment that CNN received credentials, the BBC. Yes, Dan, you're back.
Yes. When did I cut off? And I'm sorry. internet's not great here.
When you're in Syria and this was rejected to give you credentials, but you stayed in the country despite that.
Yeah, and kept working, but we did cut it a bit short because we thought that actually there was more of a risk, not to me, but to some of the people I was working with, that they could get in much bigger trouble than me, and we didn't want that to happen. So we did the best we could with the time we had. We stayed in old Damascus in an old 300-year-old hotel, which, I don't know if you've been in any of those. I mean, they're like museums. They're incredible.
Yes.
And we made it to Duma, Jabbar, and Malula in the time we had. And it was all very interesting. In a way, I'll just be totally honest. I was in a little different position. I've had basically two fixers. I had this kind of a straight guy who, was happy to work with me, but I had another fixer that he was good at what he did, but he was good at what he did because he had really strong connections to HTS. So I was in a position where HTS people were around me a lot of the time, which made it hard to navigate because I'm trying to talk to people who may be under threat. And one, they're not going to talk to me as openly, obviously. And two, I don't want to put them at risk. So there was a lot of navigation involved. I'll just tell you that, as you can imagine. The first, I'll just say, because you asked me ahead of the show, you said, well, what was things like now compared to what they were when I was there 3 years ago? First of all, what people say, the big difference on the plus side for people now is the prices have gone down quite a bit because there is basically no functioning customs, immigration, tariffs. So things are cheaper. So people are happy with that. Now, on the downside, a lot of people are not getting paid, especially government people, and including police. And so while things are cheaper, a lot of people don't have the money to buy anything. So, that's an issue. Damascus is interesting because, there are police on the streets. And by the way, these are basically HTS guys. And most of them that I saw were dressed in their fatigues with machine guns, some with masks over their face. Again, to put it in very simple terms, especially for a Western audience, I mean, they basically look like Al Qaeda, okay?
Yeah.
Which a lot of people are okay with, but a lot of people, that's a little intimidating, right? I mean, that's, for a lot of Syrians, that doesn't necessarily put them at ease. And I'll give, I guess, the most stark example of that. We went to Malula, which, Kevork, I know you know a lot about. I bet that I was there twice in 2021, and it is the most, I don't know how to put it. It's a storybook town that's built into the mountains.
And it feels different
it's like
when you're there.
Something out of a novel or a children's book. I mean, it's just it's so beautiful and quaint and old world. And people there still the language of Jesus Christ. And it is a largely Christian area, though also Bedouin live there. And when we went there, I was accompanied by an HTS soldier who was armed. And again, in the fatigues and all that. You could tell who he was. And not because I wanted to be accompanied by him, but that was the price of admission for me. And so Again, obviously that made it difficult for me to navigate a bit in Malula, to talk to people openly. And again, I didn't want to get anyone in trouble. But I had an interesting, here's a few observations I had. And I mentioned some of this on X. I mean, one, there were no cars on the streets. I mean, no one. It was empty. And these historic churches that typically have a lot of visitors there, and I witnessed that in 2021, they were virtually empty. The first church we went to, this little church, which is very ancient, which is like a little cave, had one family of tourists there in addition to us. The second church, which you're seeing the video of, the big church, which has a tomb in it, which, by the way, the terrorists destroyed the tomb back in 2013.
Yes.
And Jelani's group, the Al Nusra Front, was part of that attack on the church. That big church had no one in it, Kevork. No one. It was empty aside from a couple nuns and a priest. I mean, it was just, there was no one visiting there. And this is not typical. So I was able to talk to one priest on the record. And he was open, he was a little diplomatic in how he talked, but he mentioned that 50 families have already fled Malula to Damascus. I know of other families who fled the country entirely. And he made it clear they did not feel safe there. And also he confirmed my observations that people were not coming to the town or to the church. And so, and he wasn't sure that was going to change. He said they're trying to work with HTS to get security for the town. But again, it's not clear. I don't want to make any particular conclusions. It's not clear whether that is asking the fox to guard the hen house, right? I mean, right. And I'll tell you, I had one interesting little experience. So the guy who was armed, who was with us, to his credit, he never came into churches with me, but he waited outside. But they saw him come, us drive up with the guy, and they saw him walking around. In one of the churches, when I went up to someone, and I want to be careful, I'm not going to name their gender or what, I kind of started making small talk, and this person spoke English, and I said, "How are things?" And at first it was kind of like, "Oh, okay. How are you? Good." And the two people with me walked away a bit. They said, "Hey, Dan, come here." And I said, "Oh, wait a second. I want to talk to this person." I did. And then the person looked at me and said, "Things are terrible here." And I thought that was very telling, when the person had 1 second to be honest with me, that person made it clear that things were not good.
Yes.
And they didn't feel safe there. And they certainly didn't feel safe to talk to me in front of even these two people who were unarmed, who they didn't even know who those people were, presumably. And a second priest we talked to would not even be videotaped. He would not go on the record, and spoke in only kind of vague terms. So again, in Malula, it was a lot of what wasn't said that was, I think, spoke volumes. And I do have a friend outside Syria, I won't say where, who fled Malula and fled Syria very quickly after the HTS took over. And he doesn't want anyone to know his name, where he is. He said he still has family in Malula, and he's very worried about them and their safety. And he would not go back because he does not feel safe there. So this says volumes to me. And I met with another cleric of another church, and not in Malula, but elsewhere. And again, I don't have permission yet from him to reveal his identity.
Identity, yes.
But he was saying right. He was saying that there was some persecution of Christians happening, Christians being whipped, for example. And he showed me some photos of that. And this is the one I quoted on X, who said, look, he was not a fan of Assad. He said, we had a dictatorship, but now we have something worse. We have these extremists who are now in charge, ostensibly in charge of Syria. And, he made a few points that I think people need to realize. I mean, so one, and this should be an obvious point, but this was not a revolution that ousted Assad, okay? This was, maybe we could call it a coup. This was, relatively few amount of soldiers, about 30,000, I guess, who were able to move from Idlib to Damascus almost unmolested. And who then took over the country, or at least have presumed to. And I keep saying presumed or ostensible control, because they really don't control the country yet. I mean, and it's not clear they ever will. Right now, Palmyra is under ISIS control. Homs seems to be in certainly contested place where more extremist factions of HTS are massacring Alawites, okay? And the government in Damascus claims it can't stop them. No one knows if they can't or won't stop them, okay? Aleppo is largely controlled by Turkey. Israel controls a lot of the southern part of Syria and is within 30 kilometers of Damascus. And the U.S., along with its Kurdish allies, control about another third of Syria in the northeastern part of Syria. And so, as you can see by what I've said, no one has control over the whole of Syria. Yes. It is already, at least at the moment, it is fair to say that it's been at least temporarily balkanized, okay? But in any case, the folks who now claim they're running the country have a few things that should be discussed, and again, which this cleric mentioned. One is, of course, a lot of their fighters, I don't know the percentage, but a lot of their fighters are from foreign countries. They're not Syrian at all.
30%. Giolani said in 2015 or 16 that 30% of his army are multinational. So we're speaking about, if we have 40,000 are HTS, like 10,000 of them, around 10,000 of them, 15,000 of them are multinational. And around 5,000 of them are Uyghurs from Xinjiang, from China. We have a lot from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, who are going to receive Syrian citizenship because they are now in higher positions in the military. So the Syrian army higher command is basically comprising of different nationalities, something that is unprecedented, in my opinion, in Syria and in the region. Probably in Israel is similar because they bring Zionists from all around the world, and they receive a citizenship in Israel, and they can become in the army. So this is becoming more like the Islamic version of Zionism that HTS represents in this case, by inviting people from 10,000 kilometers away to settle in Syria to fight for them, and then receive citizenship and receive also positions in the government, basically. And we're talking about the military and the security apparatuses. And once you have your grip over the military and the security apparatus, you can rule the country. Like, he's establishing a dictatorship, a theocratical dictatorship, on the back of also this multinational takfiris. And for those are asking me, what is a takfiri basically? A takfiri is someone whose ideology is that he can perpetrate physical violence against you, including completely elimination and killing, based on your religion, ethnicity, sect, etc. Like the differences with them doesn't have to be political, but only pure ideological or religious or sectarian, for example. And the takfir is best represented by Al-Qaeda. And HTS before the rebranding was Al-Nusra, and they strictly followed these Al-Qaeda teachings. And they have been successful in occupying Idlib and having the control of this governorate, and then unleashing this army on the rest of the governorates and taking the country, or some of the country, as you already explained, from the Assad government. One of our commentators say Dan need to expand a little bit about on why they are scared. Were they part of the old Syrian government? That's why they were scared, for example, some of the people that you met, or because they have a different political opinion, or simply because they are born in what they say the wrong religion or the wrong sect. So we have different types of persecution, why they were afraid of HTS.
Okay, and right before I get to that, I just want to say, so in addition to the fact that, one, this was not an organic revolution, two, that many of the fighters are foreign fighters, including Jelani himself. I guess his family's from the Golan Heights, but he grew up in Saudi Arabia. Third, everyone who's being given high positions in the government come from Idlib. So not only are they foreign fighters, not an organic revolution, they don't represent anyone outside of Idlib for the most part. So this is a very insular type of, this government is not like a broad-based popular government. Okay, that has to be
Are you saying they're not diversity friendly then?
I think that is true, though they're claiming they are, of course. I think they're not. I mean, I think they're showing themselves not to be. And of course, we have to point out that Syria, like Lebanon, Lebanon used to be part of Syria, and Palestine, which used to be part of Syria, have been historically very diverse countries with many different religious groups and sects within those groups. So that's very dangerous, not to have a government that represents all those people. Okay. Now that brings us to the question that you raise. I mean, the folks I met in Malula were never part of the government or the armed forces. They are afraid because they are Christians. And most of the people I met, I'm just trying to be fully, I'll tell you, one guy stopped me on the street in Damascus, wanted to be interviewed when he heard I was a reporter from the U.S. But again, he gave an interview with where we filmed him from the back with a coat over his head. And he said he was an Alawite from Homs, and he talked about the massacre of Alawites that happened over the weekend.
Yes.
He was not a government guy. He was a service employee. So, I think obviously people who were part of the old government are afraid for that reason. And obviously, now that they still deserve due process, but okay, whatever. They obviously, people have those fears. But a lot of people have fears because they're Alawites, because they're Christians, because they're Shia. Many Shia have already fled the country. I think in Lebanon alone, there's 100 to 200,000 Shia that fled after HTS came to power. And again, they have great fears of being oppressed, not because they were in the government, but because they're Shia.
Yeah.
And it should be noted that according to the United Nations, their figure is that 600,000 people have fled Syria since HTS took over. And I believe HTS has bragged that 200,000 people have come back to Syria since they've taken over. Well, if you do the math, the net is that 400,000 people left. right? I mean, and are those the figures you've heard, Kevork? So there's a lot of people leaving because of their ethnic religious background. That is for sure. And again, I think the folks most in danger are the Alawites, and why? Because they're Muslim, but they're seen as apostates and heretics because they drink alcohol. In fact, use alcohol in some of their rituals. They don't wear head covering. You know, they have a more primitive form of Islam, which folks like HTS find worse than being infidels.
Yes,
Right?
they find them worse than the
Christians are
Christians.
mere infidels. Right. So, but Christians also are obviously seen as infidels, and therefore as people who, under this new government, new regime, may not have full rights. And I mean, this government, look, first of all, as one commentator pointed out, I saw an interesting thing on X. Another guy, he went to Syria for 5 days or something, and he pointed out while Jelani has been meeting with all these foreign dignitaries,
Yes.
he has yet to address the country. He's been in power for over a month, and he hasn't addressed the people. I mean, he there is no, there's very little organic connection between the HTS government, again, if that's what you want to call it, and the general population. And it's not clear, to what interest that they have in any of that. So I think it's fair to say that minority groups are living in fear, and for good cause to a large extent. I think their experience is different depending where they are at,
Yes.
what region, what city. But even in Damascus, there have been some kidnappings of some professors. I met an Alawite who just survived a kidnapping. A student of that person tried to lure that person to an area, and then the person was told by other students, "Don't go. They're going to kidnap you." And that person is also an Alawite. So it's a very serious situation. Um, and again, the Jelani's group is saying, well, yeah, those things are happening. There are massacres in homes. And that's regrettable, but either those aren't our people or they're factions of our group that we don't control. No one knows whether, again, whether it's that they can't stop the people or won't stop them. But it's now been over a month, and people are getting, they're losing patience as to whether this sort of thing is going to stop, or whether it might even speed up at some point. Because no one knows what the intentions of this HTS group really is. They've mentioned at times wanting to create Sharia law, wanting Sharia law to govern the country, which would be a disaster for the minority groups. Which, by the way, when we talk about the minority groups altogether, if I'm correct, Kevork, that's about 20% of the population.
Yes.
I guess 80% or so are
But
Sunnis.
then the problem in my opinion,
a lot. That's a large
yeah,
percentage
yes,
of the population. If you look at the African American population in the U.S., for example, they're not 20% of the population. They're much smaller than that. I don't know the percentage exactly now, but it's less than 20%, I believe. So, no one would say, oh, well, because African Americans are less than 20% of the population, that white people should be able to impose, their will upon them. In fact, everyone feels quite the opposite and should, right? Especially in this multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. And again, going back to this cleric I talked to, again, who is afraid, at least at the moment, to come forward publicly, which should be, telling to people. Um, you know, he would think if Syria was declared some sort of Islamic state, it would destroy Christianity in Syria. And I think a lot of folks in Syria think that that is already on its way to happening. A lot of Christians have left, are leaving. Again, a lot of Shia have left or leaving. With the Alawites, I don't know how many have left, but they're in the gravest danger in terms of being killed, just outright. So, and the problem, of course, is that the mainstream press and the U.S. government and other Western governments don't seem to care at all about this problem, which is a real big problem. And that will only encourage the government to continue to, again, either be part of that problem or at least or ignore it.
Yes.
Whichever
There is also another
as
problem,
happening.
Dan, and I just want to mention this because just to follow up on your thought, there is a pretension in the mainstream press and by the pro-HTS also influencers, talking heads, that HTS rule is legitimate because the majority want HTS, and they try to play the identity politics here by saying, well, 70% of the Syrian people are Sunnis, and this is their choice. And if it's HTS, then we have to accept it. But this is disingenuous because in 70%, it also includes the Kurds, and the Kurds do not accept to live under HTS rule to begin with. And also, we have a big Sunni communities in Damascus and in Aleppo and in Homs and in different places. They also reject the notion of living under HTS rule. So it's not like Syria is divided between the Sunnis and the minorities, like they're trying to portray in the mainstream press. There are even divisions within every sect and every domination. And in this case, the other side, I'm just going to bring the argument of the other side now just to hear your thought. They tell us that this is what democracy is about. Democracy is that the majority rules over the minority. Is the concept of democracy fit with this definition that if 70% of any country belongs to a certain religion, that this religion, the people who belong to this religion should rule over the country? Or democracy is about political programs? It's the rule of the people, for the people, of the people. So basically serving the people regardless of their religion and sect. And I know that the answer is probably not going to be, yes, HTS has legitimacy because 70% of the people are Sunnis. But this is what we're hearing all the time. And this is also absurd because I have Sunni friends. We communicate, and they don't want to live under HTS, but they are forced to accept this type of rule out of fear of HTS. And in this case, they are telling me one thing, which is like, when I speak to every Syrian nowadays, they tell me just this one same argument. They say, the only freedom that we got after Assad is the freedom to criticize Assad. It's like, other than that, we haven't gotten any freedoms.
I've heard that too. And maybe there's some freedom because also, HTS has not had the time to create a full police force, an intelligence service, right? So there is a certain freedom because they really haven't, consolidated their control yet. But I think that probably is coming. We'll see. Though that's probably not inevitable. But that's another issue. I mean, that is to say, to the extent people feel a certain relief, it's because the ancient regime is gone, but the new regime has not consolidated itself.
Yes.
And in fact, well, again, I mentioned there are police, these HTS guys in Damascus, but there aren't that many. There's no one directing traffic. You could do anything you want on the roads because there's just no one. They don't have the people to do that. By the way, they got rid of all the old police officers from the old government, and now it's just HTS people, which is always a mistake. That happened in Iraq after Saddam Hussein, and it just generally leads to lawlessness, and again also allows HTS eventually, when it has a full component of police, to just exert its will over people. So that's an interesting thing. But you're right. I mean, what has been gained at this point? First of all, the national sovereignty has been, at least for the moment, lost for the reasons we said. I mean, Israel now controls a huge part of the south, including Mount Hermon, the most important mountain in Syria. They control 30 to 40% of Syria's water supplies now.
Yes,
The
in the
U.S.
south.
already controls, the U.S. already controls the most oil and grain-rich part of Syria. Again, Turkey is now controlling more of the north west of Syria. So first of all, Syria as a nation is in grave jeopardy. And again, the multicultural, multi-ethnic state that has prevailed in Syria for so long is also in grave threat now. And as I mentioned, economically, things again have improved because there is cheaper prices. But again, a lot of people aren't getting paid, and that's going to start to sink in soon, right? I mean, how long can you go without a paycheck? So are things better for people? I mean, obviously, for some, they would say yes. For a lot of people, they would say no, they're worse. The one thing Assad did, whatever you think of him, I mean, I think while he didn't do it perfectly, and he could sometimes do it opportunistically, I think he did a decent job of preserving this multi-ethnic state there. I mean, that was the one thing he did do, and that I suspect that HTS that ultimately is not their goal. I mean, and just to answer the question you raise, I mean, first of all, in the West and in the United States in particular, we have a constitution that specifically protects minority rights, and the right to religion, for example, and the right to freedom of expression against majority oppression, right? And frankly, the UN Charter, well, if you read that and you read Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the main covenants, which honestly look a lot like the US Constitution, they seem to be inspired by it greatly, they also protect those things. So under international law, it isn't assumed that just because you have 70% of the population or 80% that you can impose your religion over the other 20 to 30%. And by the way, no one thinks, for example, in the West, no one thinks that it's good that Iran has an Islamic State, for example. And they have other cultures and religions there, Armenian Christians and Jews, for example, who, by the way, are allowed to practice their faith. That should be pointed out. But still, in general, it's not assumed that it's good to have a theocratic state.
Yes.
So
especially in a country like Syria, Levant is the birthplace of Christianity, and it's a place where in many of the neighborhoods, also in Damascus, Jesus also walked in the streets. It's not like it has been a non-Christian country in the past. Yes. So it was multicultural, multi-ethnic faith, and this is what I promote for Syria. I promote for a nation state under which all people have equal rights and responsibilities. And this is one of the issues that I criticize the Assad government for not being bold enough to, for example, amend the constitution and say, okay, everyone can become a president in Syria. Why it is only for the Muslims? I mean, I remember from in the 70s, Hafez al-Assad wanted to change the constitution and make it completely secular, so separate the religion from the state. Everyone can become a president, but the Muslim Brotherhood, they were very aggressive. They have also waged an armed insurgency against him, and country since then, I believe, started losing some of its secular characters. And also Assad, the son, didn't dare, let's say, to challenge the Islamist, the Muslim Brotherhood community or other powerful forces in Damascus who were rejecting this notion that we have to become like a complete secular state. And this has bothered a lot some of the supporters of Assad, because supporters of Assad, people miss the point that Assad, the father and the son, they couldn't rule Syria for 53 years were it not for the Sunnis. And there were a big portion of the Sunnis who supported Assad, and they were part of the business class. So this is a point that we have to make. It's not like the Sunnis were persecuted and they were isolated. His wife is a Sunni, and many almost every prime minister that passed have been taken charge of Syria's economy was from Sunni families, and most of the defense ministers were Sunnis in Syria. And I believe this identity politics that people started to speak or point it out and say Assad was anti-Sunni, it's very disingenuous, and it aims at creating sentiments against the government or victimhood sentiments against the government in order to remove it, because the project was regime change. As you mentioned, it wasn't a revolution, it was a coup or a regime change operation. And this always brings me into lots of trouble for saying it, although all the facts are there, and you can read all the documents, diplomatic cables, WikiLeaks, and you can see what was the plan and why they wanted for Syria to begin. One of the reasons was Israel, and you mentioned in this case Mount Hermon. I just wanted for the people to know what's happening. We have the Israel's Minister of Defense cuts from the summit of Syria's Mount Hermon, which is currently occupied by Israel. This is what he says: the Israeli Defense Forces will remain at the summit of Mount Hermon and in the security zone for an indefinite period to ensure the security of the settlements in the Golan Heights, the north, and all residents of the state of Israel. We will not allow hostile forces to establish a presence in the security zone in southern Syria from here to the Sueda-Damascus axis, and we will act against any threat. Our friend Max Blumenthal pointed out something important here, which I want also to share. He says, after quote posting this statement from the defense minister of Israel, he says, members of the Syrian opposition were clear that they were willing to give up the Golan in exchange for Israeli support. Golani's Nusra forces accepted Tel Aviv's help and ultimately provided Israel with the pretext it had sought to violate UN Resolution 338 in perpetuity. And this is the point that it doesn't make much of spotlight, I think, or when it gets people, especially on the pro-Palestine side, do not really mention the HTS collaboration with Israel or Nusra's collaboration with Israel in the past. And we have a situation where, were it not for Israel, were it not for Turkey, were it not for Qatar, were it not for Saudi Arabia, were it not for the United States and all these regional and international intelligence agencies, the regime change would not have started and would not have been accomplished in the 14 years. They have invested tens of billions of dollars in the Syrian conflict for the sake of the regime change. So, in my opinion, is a revolution is organic. It has a popular base, it has a national will, it has a clear program, what could come next after the change of the regime, it has a leader. But what happened in Syria was different intelligence agencies, they're supporting different groups. Even the anti-Assad groups, they were fighting against each other for political competition. ISIS and al-Nusra, they were one and they split it and Jolani and Baghdadi, they were basically partners, and they split it for political reasons, not for basically any ideological reasons. But then Jolani was a little bit more smarter, and he started to appeal to the American audience. He gave an interview to an American press, I think 2021, to PBS, and he started to rebrand himself, right? But I would also argue that this rebranding is not only from the Nusra part, but also from the American part, because then you have an entire propaganda machine or a media machine in the US which rebranded him, and they presented him to us as a legitimate leader. He's the one now who leads Syria, and everybody is in Syria celebrating with him, including Western officials. The HTS foreign minister was in WEF, World Economic Forum, which is like mind blowing. Like they only came to power in 6 or 8 weeks ago, and already in WEF sitting with Tony Blair, which tells you everything you need to know about the new leadership in Damascus. So I'm not like coming and hating against them out of blue. I'm just pointing out to certain facts which are so questionable about the HTS, its project, who the backers of HTS, and where Syria is headed toward. But I will ask you just two more questions then in this context, one of which is Bogdanov, I think he's the deputy foreign minister of Russia. Bogdanov, he visited Syria and he met with Jolani recently. And Iran also said that they had communicated with HTS through mediators. Do you think that Russia and Iran are going to, paint some legitimacy for HTS, or they're playing realpolitik with HTS?
Well, I think the two are not mutually exclusive. Obviously, I think Russia will deal with who's ever in power there, is the truth. I think they wait to see if these guys will stay in power, because I think there's a huge question about that. I think Iran will be more reluctant to do so. Will also take a certain wait and see attitude. It all depends how things iron out, whether this regime lasts, whether they do truly have elections. Jelani said at first he said he'd have them in March, and now he's saying, well, we'll have them within 4 years. I think a lot of countries are going to wait to see what the nature of this government is. And a lot of people don't know that. And it should be pointed out, a lot of Syrians don't know it. I mean, a lot of people there are just holding their breath. They're hoping for the best, but they don't know. And we don't know, And again, Jelani hasn't even bothered to address the nation to tell them what his plans are, if he even knows what they are, which is significant. But I want to get back to something real quickly, and I don't know how much time we have. By the way, I don't know how long
we have five more minutes.
Okay, I just want to quickly say that the U.S. in particular and Great Britain in particular, those two countries have done everything they can to prevent secular governments from coming to power in West Asia or from staying in power. Right? They have supported the worst extremists to destabilize countries like Syria and Libya and Afghanistan, and have prevented secular, and I will say as leftist socialist governments from coming to power and really serving the interest of all people in West Asia. And this is what you get. You get this. HTS, which, again, was put in power by the West through a vicious war that began in 2011, but honestly, the groundwork for that was laid before then, and by a vicious economic war, which has crippled Syria. And that needs to be pointed out to people. I mean, that's the one thing you notice in Syria. It is so grindingly poor. So the infrastructure is so dilapidated. This was a once beautiful country, and it is been destroyed. It has been wrecked. And the West did that. And it is heartbreaking. This is the cradle of civilization, and it has been destroyed. The multiculturalism's been destroyed. And, how we move forward now, or how the Syrians move forward now, it's going to be very difficult. And one of the biggest demands people have now, and it doesn't matter if they're Palestinian or they're Alawite or Christian, they want sanctions and they need to breathe. And they
Yes.
do deserve that. I do not support U.S. sanctions as any method
Me
of,
neither.
of coercing other peoples, and I don't care who's in government. And that's got to end now. And Syria has got to be able to rebuild. And I honestly think if that happens, I think that will actually prevent extremism from taking hold. I think the more these people are crushed, the more extreme elements will probably likely take power. The other thing I just wanted to point out, I mean, just so people have a sense of things, I have friends in Syria who will not leave their homes right now. They are afraid to go to work. They are afraid to live their lives, afraid to send their children to school. And again, it's because they're Alawites, they're Christians. This has to be addressed. And people can't live that way,
Yes.
especially by virtue of their religious views or ethnicity. And very few people, I get a lot of communication via Twitter, via Facebook, and everyone say, Dan, I appreciate what you're saying about the oppression of people here and the human rights abuses, but please don't tell anyone I told you that.
Yes. Yes.
So in many ways, I feel, I went there and I continue to speak out because there are a lot of people in Syria who really can't speak out for themselves because they fear violent retribution.
I just want to tell you one of the commentators. She says, "Love you, Dan. We'll be getting your book on Palestine soon. Your book on Venezuela is incredible. Thank you both. And just for guys, for you to know,
Thank you.
once this stream is over, I will add one more link for the book, The Case for Palestine. I just realized that this is only in Europe, so I will add also the American version, so you can also purchase it from the United States and from Europe. The Case for Palestine is in the description below. Then just last question in 2 minutes. What would be your message to Donald Trump? What different policy approach he could pursue for the best interest of the Syrian people and the region? Because this is something I would like to mention, and it is very important. Syria is not only a cradle of civilization. Syria will, whatever ideology rules Syria, it could project on the entire region, which means HTS experience could be normalized on the entire region. So what policy approach should Donald Trump do? Because I'm quite sure that this is not in the US interest to have an HTS type of region, especially among the allies of the US in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, and the UAE.
I certainly don't think it is in reality, though I'm sure there's some in the U.S. government who think it might be, but I think it is not, and it's not in the interest of the Syrian people, and that's first and foremost my concern. Um, I think first of all, again, I think sanctions need to be lifted entirely. I think Syria needs to be economically allowed to trade and be part of the world markets, just as Cuba should be, and Venezuela and Nicaragua. Again, there's a huge irony. I know you've seen this, Kevork, that the same people, the HTS who was supported sanctions against Assad, are now saying, well, it only hurts
Yes.
the people. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
But despite the fact they're hypocrites, they are right about that. And I don't want to hurt the people. And I think the world owes a huge economic package to Syria to help it rebuild, because the world really participated in that war. You've heard the figure that during the conflict, um, passports from 84 different countries were captured
Yes. Yes.
amongst the opposition fighters. 84 this was a world war against Syria. People don't realize that. So the world owes Syria, to help it rebuild. Now, I think that is where some pressure can be put. That is to say, I think there should be a big package, but I think that could be given in stages, conditioned on HTS really forming a a unity government that includes all groups and holds elections. And I think that that is something that would be a positive thing. And of course, he's got to get out of Syria. He's got to get out. Israel's got to get out. Turkey's got to get out. Syria is for the Syrians.
Dan, this is a great message. I believe that any Syrian who belongs to Syria and feels patriotic towards Syria would say the same thing. I hope more Syrians would be also convinced of this, and probably sooner or later they will realize that the country is headed into the very difficult direction. But we're here just trying to brainstorm and raise some arguments. We're not trying to hate against any political parties or political movements. We are for freedom of political practice in the country and freedom of press and speech. But we will criticize any human rights violations, and especially when it comes to the persecution of HTS, which pretends to be a democratic group. Meanwhile, the truth of the matter is they are regressive and they are undemocratic, the least to say. Guys, first of all, I would like to thank every one of you, and I would like to thank our respected guest today, Dan Kovalik, who joined us from Beirut after visiting Syria, and he told us in length and thorough what he saw and the expected scenarios. And as I mentioned, his social media accounts and also his book is in the description below. If you're liking this content, just hit the like button and leave a comment and subscribe to this YouTube channel. It's very important. We're going to 100K soon on YouTube. And if you like to support my work, you can become a patron. The link is scrolling on the screen, patreon.com/Syriana Analysis. And there are also other means in the description below. And I will see you tomorrow, 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time, with a Syrian woman from Aleppo who is now in the United States, and she's going to share her thoughts about what happened in Syria, especially that she has received lots of backlash for being a Syrian, for being a woman, for being a Muslim, and for being a Sunni, and against HTS. So all these mainstream talking heads are criticizing her and trying to smear her. I will have her tomorrow on the show. Stay tuned for that, and we will see you soon. Peace be upon you, upon your families.